Hi everyone, and welcome to part 3 of our farmer communication series under the ASEAN Fall Armyworm Action Plan. My name is Alison Watson and I'm very pleased to be moderating this session. I'm joined by a very diverse group of experts today, many of whom you can see at the moment on the screen, and they will be speaking on pesticide behaviour, decision making and communication. I also have our ASEAN Fall Armyworm Action Project assistants, Putra and Randolph and Samuel joining us later, and Putra is already on the session with us, so thank you very much for joining us as well. We have 5 excellent speakers today. You'll see this on a very busy agenda. We'll be moving very fast, and so it's going to be quite an intensive session, but you will have time for questions, and they will be following each speaker's presentation. I think what's very exciting about today's session is we have a lot of case studies and we have a lot of examples drawn from around the region, including Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos. And we also have further afield from Zambia as well as Australia. Before we start, I just want to remind you that a recording of the webinar will be made and it will be distributed 1 week after the session, and I will email everyone, but you can also find it on the Fall Armyworm Action website, which I will give you the address soon. If you have any technical questions today or problems, try logging off and on. That's often the best way to resolve them. You can send a message to us in the chat though as well, and we may be able to help you. Please use the Q&A box today to ask questions to all our speakers. It's really important because it helps us manage the flow of the questions and it's a lot more efficient. If you have the chance, you can rename yourself and put your organisation behind you by pressing the More button up there. We're on arrow 3. And if you want to say hello, and some of you already have, and please do so, introduce yourself in the chat box. That's where we sort of have a more informal discussion. If you want to thank a speaker, please do so there, share a link or highlight an important point from your own research or your own work in the field. Please use that chat and get a conversation going. Right, well, time flies. We're actually up to session 3 of a 4-part farmer communication series to catalyse action on the development and design of more effective farmer communications on integrated pest management and fall armyworm control. Now, if you want a participation today, and I know that many of you will, you must participate to the Farmer Communication Forum and either ask a question, share an interesting fact or information about work that you're doing, or note something that you found useful in the workshop. And I really encourage everyone to go to this forum and actually share that sort of information and knowledge across our community. And you can do that by going to the community page at www.aseanfawaction.org, and then you'll see how you go into the forum, and then there's a forum for farmer communication. So please just click onto that. Now, I'm just going to see if we can run a poll to warm us up. We're almost at 100 participants, so this is a good opportunity to really see what people are thinking. And I am not taking I'm not taking names here. It's anonymous, so this is a little bit of fun. It's not a rigorous poll, but what I wanted to ask you is question 1, and hopefully you can see that. This is based on a study of vegetable farmers in Vietnam, which looked at the sources of information from where farmers sought advice on pest management. I'm going to ask you, from what source do you think that most farmers obtain their information from? So you've got 4 choices there: lead farmers, government extension agents, friends and neighbours, or pesticide shops. And don't worry if you don't get the right answer. We're just having a bit of quiz here to warm you up. The second question is, in one study, farmers who sought advice from pesticide shopkeepers used, and you've got to give me what you think is the correct answer. 42% less pesticide, 45% less pesticide, 45% more, 93% more, or 251% more. I'm going to give everyone 30 seconds more. And I'm afraid I don't think any of our speakers can actually take part in the poll. I'm not sure. But one of our speakers probably knows the results of this because it is their research that I've drawn from. So that would be slightly inside information, I think. So I'm going to enter the poll. And I'm going to share the results. So for the first one, where did farmers seek their advice on pest management from in this particular research study? So we've got around 50% say pesticide shops, friends and neighbours, government extension agents and lead farmers. Well, most farmers in this study actually received or obtained their information from pesticide shops. So there we go, 49%, but that sort of is pretty good for that. So it was around where do you think that most farmers obtained that information from? And we'll hear from a speaker later on that will explain these results and actually give some more detail about other countries as well from this research. The second question is also from a research project that one of our speakers actually undertook. And it was in one study, farmers who sought advice from pesticide shopkeepers used. The answer was actually 251% more pesticide. So it's pretty high there. So only 10% people guessed that. What was really interesting is that for the average farm and while controlling for other factors, farmers who sought advice from friends and neighbours used 45% less pesticide. Pesticide use was 42% less when a woman was in charge of pest management. And interestingly, 31% used less pesticide when farmers had already adopted biopesticides. So I just wanted to warm you up there, and please keep those in mind because we're going to hear from one of the researchers involved in that project later. Right. I did do a bit of a quick look at some of the research that's been out there recently in this whole topic area of pesticide decision making and communication. There is quite a lot, and I'm sure I've only just scratched the surface in identifying some of the more recent studies done. But what I'm really keen to hear about and see are real examples out there in the field right now within our region. So if you know of any work, pilots, activities within Southeast Asia, please contact us at faw@growasia.org and share with us some of those examples. And that brings me to our first speaker today. I'm going to ask the other speakers, you can probably turn off your videos now, and I'm going to welcome Dr. Aditi Mankad, who is a senior research scientist and team leader with the Sustainability Pathways Program within CSIRO, Land and Water Australia. Aditi will be speaking about the behavioural drivers of agri-pest control, which are key for sustainable agriculture. Welcome, Aditi.
Thank you, Alison. Would you like me to share my screen?
Yes, that would be great. Oh, yes, that would be great. Thank you. I'll just stop my share.
How's that?
Perfect.
Great. Okay. Well, it's nice to have the opportunity to speak to everyone today. As Alison said, my name is Aditi Mankad. I'm with CSIRO in Australia. I'm a team leader in CSIRO, and our team looks at biosecurity and biotechnology issues around the social and economic sciences. The presentation I'll be making today is on the importance of understanding farmer decision making, this is kind of a summary of a lot of different bits of work that we've been doing at CSIRO. So I'd like to acknowledge the input of my CSIRO colleagues in developing this work as well. So I wanted to start by kind of framing it in the sense of what will the future look like? So in the not too distant future, agricultural systems will have to produce sufficient, nutritious and food and fibre with fewer chemical inputs. While agricultural processes have made significant advances, even in the last decade or so, innovations do come with a cost. And at times, shorter-term financial profits are often prioritized ahead of longer-term impacts that could promote more systemic change. To reach sustainability, producers should also be alerted to future risks that they may encounter, such as product availability, with more stringent regulations of chemicals and their use. Certainly here in Australia, we are already seeing the deregistering and phasing out of crucial chemical control options for significant agricultural pests such as Queensland fruit fly. Despite novel chemical-free techniques emerging to control insect pests, a reliance on chemicals persists, often due to enduring beliefs about increased efficacy, efficiency, and productivity gained when using them. And often these attitudes are rooted in personal experiences and generational beliefs about what works, based on what their father did or what their mother did, and what the community may agree is useful. While there are agricultural enterprises that choose to diversify and reduce their dependence on chemicals, others consider it too risky a gamble to take. And this is particularly true for those enterprises that may not have enough bandwidth to change their practices. Sorry, I'm just trying to move that. There we go. So in our research, we've done quite a few different types of qualitative and quantitative surveys. And often we find the models to come up with several factors that are important. You can see on the right-hand side there that the higher the value, the higher the relationship with behavior change. So you can see there that the strongest predictor we've consistently found is self-efficacy, and that relates to one's belief in their ability to carry out recommended behaviors. And then the second most important factor has been threat severity or perceived threat. So in this case, we could say perceived threat is a reduction in availability of chemical use, and so there is a need to change behavior. And that's also supported in this idea that procedural knowledge is very important. So you'll notice at the bottom there, we've got general knowledge and procedural knowledge. So general knowledge really refers to, say, general knowledge about a pest or general knowledge, of a change. But procedural knowledge refers to actual knowledge of how do I change my behavior? And that's really important in predicting behavior change. The other factor that's really important is response efficacy, and that is somebody's belief in the efficacy of a recommended behavior. So if we're asking farmers to change their behaviors from using a particular chemical to something else, then the individual must believe that that change is actually going to be effective in achieving the goal. So you can see that there are multiple factors that can be involved in predicting behavior change. Other factors that we found to be really important through interviews and things are listed here. And so we've divided them out between barriers and facilitators. So for example, barriers include the cost of change. So one of the quotes here we had is, the biggest barrier is the cost and their own individual situation. Growers are struggling with their backs to the wall and would do as little as they can and try not to spend any money. They're reluctant to do anything at all, and it hurts everyone else, but that's the reality of it. Another barrier is this lack of knowledge for change, as well as apathy. So the quote here is, you know what growers are like. They don't want to admit that there is anything wrong, and to have a shared approach, you have to admit there is a problem. Another factor that is seen to be a barrier sometimes is incompatibility. And this is quite important because farmers don't generally like to change up too many things, because these are practices that they have developed over years and years, on their farms. And it's really dependent on what works on their farm and something that's been optimized for their particular land. And so changing custom of practice can be a very difficult process, is some of the information that we received. And then finally, in terms of the barriers, a lack of cooperation. So in the work that we've done around Queensland fruit fly, for example, there was a concern that farmers were free riding a little bit, and so they were waiting for others or neighbours to kind of change their practices and then benefiting as a result of someone else's change. And so this lack of cooperation was a real barrier to certain individuals changing their behaviours. In terms of the facilitators that we have found to be important, market access and increased, I guess, exposure to different markets was a real big driver. So the quote here is, I think if you look at the benefits associated with market access, that is a key motivator in itself. Increased awareness of change is also really important, and that kind of speaks to that procedural knowledge thing that, that came up as well in our model, where if people know what the change is required, then they're more likely to carry out that change. Leadership was another one that came up. And this refers to those larger growers within a particular region making the change first. So often these larger enterprises can be early adopters because they have the bandwidth to be able to take on a change. And so the comments here were, I think if you got the big growers on board, a lot of the small recalcitrant ones will look at the big fellows and say, they're doing it, so I should probably be doing it. And there are always innovators, leaders, then followers and anchors in every community. So there is an understanding often in these regional farming communities in Australia, for example, that if the larger growers are taking the time to invest in change, then probably that's the right way to go. Then you've got the supply chain actors. And again, this was really important in driving behavior change because it's kind of like an indirect way of forcing a grower to change. And so in Australia, we interviewed fruit growers. And so, you know, I'm not sure if this is the same around the world, probably is, but fruit is sent to a packing house. And so these packers actually demanded certain standards of the fruit that they agreed to pack. And so in a way, that's kind of forces change. So they are just really effective conduits to growers, is the comment. And maybe those packing sheds, particularly the buyers of the fruit, maybe they can influence the growers. And finally, credibility is an important facilitator. So the comment is, if they see damage, then they really get on board pretty quick. Then it just comes down to the cost of change. As long as it's not outrageous, then they will get on board. And so in that sense, credibility really refers to efficacy. So being able to see the change and the outcome of a change is a good driver. Based on the work that we've done, we also think that economic and policy mechanisms are really important. And so developing a nationally coordinated policy around reducing chemical use is pivotal to changing farmers' behaviours. And if we take the example of Denmark, which, you know, put in a tax around chemical use from the late 1980s to the present, is a really good example. And there, in the years between 2011 and 2017, they reduced pesticide use up to about 25%. And so that's a really good example of how different tax structures and different types of other incentives have really improved changes in pesticide use. And so these types of nationally coordinated policy measures can be really helpful. And producers' decision-making would be more effectively influenced if you do implement different types of economic and policy mechanisms. So this idea of differentiated taxes for different types of enterprises, subsidies from governments, targeted insurance, and independent and reliable extension information. Now, in the work that we've done in Australia, which you know, perhaps is a little different to some of the work that Alison just talked about before, we found that growers actually use extension officers as a really important source of information for them in terms of how they use their chemicals on farm. And so particularly in Australia, where it's such a large country, extension officers are really important. And often they are tied to particular chemical companies, but they are seen as working for the grower. And so they are really important sources of information. The role of the consumer, we would argue, is really important. So consumers are obviously central to driving market change through their purchasing habits. And often it's consumer demand that changes systemic kind of practices. So consumers also influence investment in sustainable agriculture. And so therefore it's important to target those market and consumer values around pesticide impact. And certainly in Australia, there is greater awareness around pesticide use and a desire for the consumer to buy more organic. So I'll just close by, I guess, advocating for this idea of convening a national conversation. So different farming cultures mean that different communities of practice will have different rationales or ideas for using certain control practices. And that's pretty evident even within Australia and not just within the region. Change will rely on the cooperation of a wide range of actors across the supply chain. So not only do growers have to get on board, but different members of the supply chain like packing houses, transportation companies, for example, and also peak industry bodies are really important to also set this standard or best practice guidelines for engaging in chemical use behaviours. And evidence-based options are key. So farmers are unwilling to change their behaviours or invest unless there is a clear business case and evidence that they can draw from. Farmer-to-farmer learning is really important. And we see that, in our biosecurity incursions, for example, in North Queensland, where, if it's an experience that they haven't really encountered before, then farmers really rely on each other to come up with the best solutions. And providing opportunities for gaining procedural knowledge is also really important. And you can do that through training mechanisms, again, maybe supported or subsidized by the peak industry bodies. So that was it from me. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Aditi. That was really interesting. And I liked all the examples. And I should say that I think it's very important across our region, across the Southeast Asia, that the role of extension agents is extremely important as well. So it's a very good point. A couple of questions. And you talked about the sort of, I guess, the influence of consumers. And I think this is a really interesting part of the issue. I've got a couple of questions related to that. Firstly, I mean, you say that consumers are maybe more aware now or want more information or have some concerns around pesticide residues or the use of pesticides. Do you think, though, that they understand how that food is produced, though, and what crop protection really means? And is there some work that can be done there so that it's not just about bad pesticides and the bad part of agriculture, but it's also about understanding what responsible pest management is and the appropriate use of different pest controls? What are your thoughts there? And just before you answer that question, I guess there's another question related to that from Andy here, I see, around well, a more effective approach would be if growers also receive price incentives because they comply. So I think that's sort of related as well. Are consumers willing to pay for that?
Yeah, no, I think they're really good points to make. So I guess to the first part, do consumers really know, how their food is grown or where it comes from? And I'm sure this is clear in a lot of colleagues' work as well, is that no, not really. They don't really know where it comes from. But that is not actually important, right? So it's all about perception. So often, particularly consumers that live in maybe, cities who are very far removed from that food production process, it doesn't actually matter if they know how it's grown. What matters is their perception. So, we can try to educate people as much as possible and say, look, in order to produce the kind of food that you are looking for, we need to implement A, B, and C in order to do that. And you may not like that, but that's how you produce an orange carrot that's so orange and beautiful, for example. So I don't think consumers really care. I think they just want this assurance that, it's as clean as can be in that process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. I think that's a really important point because it's often talked about, but I think perception is, really important part of that. Not necessarily what is actually happening, it's what people perceive are happening that's important.
Yes.
Here's another question. Is there a difference, do you find, in your research between behavioural decision making between the sexes or the gender, between male and female farmers, and is there ways that can be leveraged?
I think in Australia, it's not really a significant difference. It's more potentially it's kind of generational actually over here. So, you have farmers in different points of their careers. Some are looking for succession planning, others are looking to wind down their enterprises. And often that can make an influence on the decisions that are made. Over in Australia, I guess it's a very male-dominated space, and so we don't really have the data to make representative comparisons to make those calls. So yeah, not so much, but more so I guess stage of career or stage of life of an enterprise.
Okay, no, that's interesting. You mentioned how the lack of cooperation could be a barrier. How do you overcome that lack of cooperation between farmers?
Yeah, it's not easy, and I wish I had the best answer for that. I think it's identifying what is considered a mutual win, and so making sure that each player in that story has some benefit out of it. So, and it won't be the same answer for every situation, right? So, particular regions may have different incentives that work. And so that earlier point about, economic incentives for compliance, I think in some of the work that we've done, it does show that economic incentives work, but to a point, I think. So, changing a small thing can be really influential, but if a farmer is required to change a whole lot of things, then, no amount of incentive can change that unless there is a really clear value proposition for them.
Excellent, thank you very much, Aditi. We're actually going to stop there. I see a couple of questions in the Q&A, and if you have the chance to jump in there and write some answers, that would be great. There'll be more coming through, I'm sure. But great presentations, and to be honest, it's a really good starting presentation, because a lot of the things you're talking about are actually going to be discussed in more detail by our following speakers, who are going to show some examples of consumer pull and also detailed sort of discussions of farmer and extension service agents discussions, etc. So thank you very much. Great start. And it's wonderful to have you join us. Thank you, Aditi.
Thanks.
Okay, so with that first great presentation over, we're going to move on to our second speaker, Dr. Srinivasan Ramasamy, and he is the flagship program leader of Safe and Sustainable Value Chains and lead entomologist at the World Vegetable Centre. Srini will be talking about some very interesting research that's been conducted on farmers' knowledge, attitudes and practices on synthetic pesticide use in Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam and Laos. And actually I drew a few sort of results for our sort of quick poll before. So Srini might be able to talk a little bit about that as well. And I know there's one slide that's going to address that. So welcome, Srini, to the workshop. And if you could just maximize your screen. Perfect.
Okay, thank you, Alison. Is my screen visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I'm going to briefly talk about the farmers' knowledge, attitude, and practices (CAP) on the synthetic pesticide use in vegetable production systems in 4 selected Southeast Asian countries. So just before entering into my talk, I would like to acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Pepin Srinivasan, the flagship program leader for enabling impact as well as a healthy diets program, who coordinated these studies in all the countries. And of course, the studies were funded by 2 different projects from the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. So as we all know, the vegetables are high value crops. They generate a high income per unit area when we compare it with the staple crops, specifically cereals. So the vegetable production is an important component in the farming systems as well as in the diets of Asian countries, including the Southeast Asia. However, because of the tropical and subtropical nature, the vegetable production is constrained severely by the pests and diseases. So the farmers rely quite heavily on the use of chemical pesticides to thwart the damage caused by the pests and diseases. So the pesticide misuse is a huge problem. In fact, it's a global problem in vegetable production. And Southeast Asia is not an exception. And many of the Southeast Asian countries are also experiencing a rapid growth in terms of pesticide use, not only in vegetable production, but also in general in the crop production. So the indiscriminate use of pesticides lead to huge impact on both the environmental health as well as the human health, including the consumers, also the farm workers. So we need to find and deploy comprehensive interventions at different levels. So the interventions need to go from the farm to the policy level to address all these pesticide related risks. So here I'm going to highlight the major results from 2 different studies. The first study was conducted to gain more insights on the farmers' knowledge, attitudes, and pest management practices in 3 countries, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. And here, of course, we try to understand the knowledge of the farmers on different insects, including the beneficials, their life cycles, and the pesticide safety. And we also measured the perceived effectiveness as well as the health impacts of the pesticides, and documented the actual pest management practices, including the alternatives, if any, used by the farmers, and if they go for all the safety precautions while applying the chemical pesticides. So the study focused on 3 countries, as I indicated, predominantly on 2 different crops, yallang bean and leafy brassicas. And the leafy brassicas vary from country to country. For example, leafy mustard in Cambodia and Chinese cabbage or pak chai in other countries. So it involves the 2 different the documentation. One includes the focus group discussions. The other one is a questionnaire-based survey. So we try to identify 150 growers per crop per country. So totally we interviewed about 900 vegetable producers in both the countries. The other study was focusing on 2 countries, Thailand and Vietnam, exclusively on the yallang bean. So coming to the results. So I don't want to get into all the detailed results, but I would like to draw your attention on the marketable yield. In yallang bean, if you see the variation among the countries in terms of yield, it was quite high. Laos is harvesting at least close to 15% of what Vietnam is harvesting, 25% of what Cambodia is harvesting. So the productivity is much, much lower in some of the countries. And similarly for leafy mustard, when we compare the yield of Cambodia, again, Laos is recording only 40 to 50% of what Cambodia or Vietnam has been harvesting. So the huge variability in terms of productivity, also because of the complexity of the pest and diseases and other agronomic practices. And the other study also recorded a similar result. For example, in Ylang bean in Thailand and Vietnam, the yield of Ylang bean in Thailand is much lower when you compare the yield in Vietnam. Both the studies showed more or less similar yield level in Vietnam. Okay, so the farmers mainly they perceive the pest and diseases as the major constraint. So before they make a decision to apply on the pest control measures, we wanted to understand whether the farmers have proper understanding of the different insect pests as well as the beneficials in the farm. So we used the pictorial guide to record their responses. So 50% or above farmers are quite aware of the most of the major pests that cause damage in their crops, both the leafy brassicas or the yellow bean. When it comes to the beneficials, again, many of the farmers are able to identify some of the commonly known predators or pollinators like bees in the field. So the knowledge on the pests and beneficials are quite significant in these countries. Then coming to the perceptions on the effectiveness of pesticides, you can see here, on an average, about 80% of the farmers in all the countries, they strongly believe that mixing of different pesticides makes it more effective. So they wanted to mix more number of pesticides in a single spray. And they also strongly believe that such a pesticide use increases their farm profits. And again, almost 70% of the farmers in all the countries, they think biopesticides are not as effective as the chemical pesticides. Of course, Vietnam is an exception because of the much more awareness among the growers. So only about 43% of the farmers don't believe in the biopesticides. However, again, 2/3 of the respondents in all the countries, they think that a good pesticide is the one that kills all the insects immediately after application. Okay, so this is in fact reflecting in the use of pest control tools, especially the pesticides. So here you can see that almost 92% of the farmers, they rely on the chemical pesticides as the major mean of controlling the insect pest in these vegetable crops. And if you look at the use of biopesticides, it's almost zero in both Laos and Cambodia, whereas at least close to 75% of the farmers in Vietnam are using the biopesticides. So now you can correlate the previous slide where you see only about 43% of the farmers do not believe in the efficacy of biopesticides. So Vietnam, among the three countries, is quite ahead in terms of using the biopesticides. Probably it is not only related to the awareness among the farmers, but also the accessibility and availability of the biological alternatives to chemical pesticides. However, in all the countries, the other alternatives like crop rotation, using the protective netting, or use of trap traps or barrier traps or colored sticky traps or pheromone traps, they are all very, very minimal, or sometimes it's close to zero. And coming to the spraying frequency in terms of all the three countries, almost like 83% of the growers, they apply at least one spraying every week. And every time they apply about 1 kilogram of the pesticide. And if you look at who is applying the pesticide, because it has an implication in terms of decision making, which I show in the later slide, Vietnam ranks high in terms of female applicators, because at least half of the pesticide applicators in Vietnam are female. On an average, 1/3 of the pesticide applicators are female in these three countries. However, 75% of the growers, they mix different pesticides for single spray. And this varies from 2 to 4 pesticides, with Cambodia being the leader, with about 4 pesticides in single spray. When I meant pesticides, not only insecticide, it also included fungicides. And the other study from Thailand and Vietnam also recorded the similar information. For example, over 64 to 80% of the farmers in these countries, they apply the pesticides weekly in year-long bean production. And again, almost all the farmers try to mix different pesticides in a single spray. And majority of the farmers are either satisfied or highly satisfied with their pesticide application and pest control with the chemical pesticides in these countries. So these kind of perceptions or attitudes became a major barrier if we want to promote the alternatives, including biologicals or IPM. When the farmers believe strongly in the use of pesticides and they are highly satisfied, it's very difficult to change their attitude in the beginning. Okay, so you have seen in the beginning of this workshop, you have some of you have responded to the poll. Who is the source of advice on the pest management in some of these countries? So here you can see, at least in Vietnam and Cambodia, the pesticide shopkeepers, the input retailers are the major source of information, followed by the friends and neighbors. And you can see the government extension system or the lead farmers, they play a very, very minimal role in these countries. Whereas in Laos, it's a bit interesting. You can see the friends and neighbors and the lead farmers, they are actually the major source of information for the growers. And the perceived health effects among the vegetable farmers in these 3 countries, in both Cambodia and Laos, actually they perceive a lot of the pesticide poisoning symptoms, and they also, this is a self-poisoning symptom. So the majority of the farmers in both Cambodia and Laos, they responded many of the symptoms experienced by themselves during the pesticide application. And when it comes to the protective gears, many of the farmers, they use the common dressing like the long sleeve shirts or long trousers. They use masks, hats, or the rubber boots or gloves. However, the use of eye protector or the respirator or the raincoat or a overcoat, it's very minimally practiced. The common dressings and the masks or the hats, they are commonly used by many of the applicators. And this slide is one of the most important slides. I would like to just walk through the highlighted results. I have shown Vietnam is a leading country where the majority of the applicators are also women. So whenever a woman is in charge of the pest management practice, the pesticide use is reduced by 42%. This is quite amazing. And when the farmers, they receive the advice from their neighbors or friends, they actually reduced the pesticide application by 45%. And this is the most important result you need to see, because when the farmers receive the advice from the input retailers like pesticide shopkeeper, the pesticide use has increased by 251%. This is significant. So if you recall, majority of the farmers in Cambodia and Vietnam, when they rely on the advice from the pesticide retailers, their pesticide application naturally goes higher. And pesticide price is one of the determinant for reducing the pesticide use in vegetable production system. And similarly, when farmers get more access to the biopesticides, again, the pesticide reduction is being reduced to the extent of 31%. And coming to the last slide, which is related to the determinants of the pesticide poisoning, again, the woman applicator actually they reported at least more than 3 symptoms compared to the men applicators. So the women applicators are quite aware of the pesticide poisoning symptoms. So then they reported more number of symptoms than the men. Similarly, when they use more quantities of chemical pesticides, naturally the number of symptoms reported is also going higher. And pesticide mixtures or the years of using experience in using pesticides, they also contribute to report more number of symptoms. So coming to the conclusion, farmers are well aware of the health risks of the chemical pesticide use, but they strongly believe that pesticides are indispensable from the crop production practices. And the farmers are quite knowledgeable about the pests as well as the beneficial organisms. And they also know about the use of biopesticides and its role to reduce the use of synthetic chemical pesticides. So the more interventions are necessary to increase the availability of the biopesticides within the reach of the farmers, so they can easily access the biological pesticides, which can contribute to the reduction of the chemical pesticides. With this, I would like to stop and thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to answer if you have any questions.
Srini, that was great, and so much detail in there. I'm sure a lot of people will want to see the PDF copy of this presentation so that they can look through some of those figures in more detail. And just to reassure people, you will all be able to see that copy. We will distribute that. Lots of questions here. Here's a question: how important is the crop to the pesticide use behaviour? I mean, you gave some examples of different crops there, but is there a difference between high value crops and lesser value crops, or how context specific is it?
Yes, of course, the crops are quite important determinants of the pesticide use. For example, if you take the leafy brassicas, they are the short cycle crops. So the farmers grow like at least 4 to 5 different cycle of crops in a year, and they are also high value crops. So in 45 to 60 days, the farmer should be able to generate an income of like $1,000 to $2,000 per hectare in these countries. So because of this nature, and these brassica crops are naturally susceptible to different pests starting from the germination stage. So these crops receive an extremely high amount of pesticides compared to crops like, say, tomato or eggplant. So the value of the crops and the pest complex of that particular crop are the major factors in terms of deciding the pesticide to be used.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay. Here's a couple of questions here. Are those 75% of farmers using biopesticides in Vietnam continuing to use synthetic pesticides also?
Well, actually, they proportionately reduce the use of chemical pesticide. So when they bring in a biological pesticide, actually they reduce the chemical pesticide. And this is increasing over the years now. So based on my experience in Southeast Asia over the last 15 years, the availability of the biopesticides is getting increased in the recent times. Of course, Vietnam is a pioneer. And even after completing the study in the last 4 years, because of the significant progress happening in Cambodia, the biological pesticides are becoming available more and more in Cambodia. So if we conduct the study now, the scenario will be quite different in places like Cambodia. So there is a proportionate reduction in terms of using the chemical pesticides when the farmers go for more of the alternatives.
Okay. A couple more questions here then related to that. From the data presented, it seems that Vietnam has the highest yield since they also use synthetic pesticides and biopesticides the highest. Do we know which products provide the highest effect to the yield?
Okay, the yield I don't attribute solely to the use of chemical pesticides because the land holding used for vegetable production in Vietnam is comparatively very small when we compare both the Cambodia and Laos PDR. So because of the intensive nature of the crop production, and when we extrapolate the data per hectare, the productivity goes very high in Vietnam. So it cannot be solely attributed to the biological pesticides or IPM alone.
Okay, excellent. Here's a question from an anonymous attendee. There is a perception that biopesticides are not as effective as synthetic ones, and farmers using biopesticides need to therefore absorb losses for several early seasons before gaining a long-term benefit. Is this true? And if yes, who do you think should cover for these initial losses? Because farmers themselves live hand to mouth, and certainly most would not have the capital to do so.
Okay, so the increase in the use of biological pesticides or IPM in these countries are happening also because of the changes in the production systems. For example, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, they have introduced the certified production system. One is the GAP certified production systems. The other one is the organic production systems. Of course, as I indicated earlier, Vietnam is a pioneer in many of these aspects. So Viet GAP was introduced more than 10 years ago. So there are some farmers or farmer cooperatives, they entered into the Viet GAP certified production system. And the GAP certified production systems are quite recent in both the Laos and Cambodia.
Yeah.
However, even before the GAP certified system, even before a formal organic certified production systems in Cambodia, you can see there are lots of spontaneous initiatives by the private sector who started promoting the safe production of fruits and vegetables. And even they set up the outlets, retail outlets in big cities, including Phnom Penh or Siem Reap. So these producers or the retailers, actually, they have an organized producers who have adopted more of these alternatives and the safe inputs for producing safe fruits and vegetables.
Yeah.
So, of course, there could be a reduction in terms of productivity, or even sometimes the quality, the appearance of the fruits and vegetables may not be so appealing compared to the high input systems. However, because of the consumer preference and because of a kind of incentive they receive from these retailers, the producers are more and more encouraged to go for the alternatives. So I would say because of the changes in the production systems happening and the more and more growing demand among the consumers for the safe producers, the changes in terms of adoption is happening. Okay. So as someone rightly pointed out in the earlier presentation, the consumers, actually, they are the pull factor for the large scale adoption of these alternatives. So this is the practical evidence we get it from these countries.
Okay, great. Couple of quick questions and then we have to move on. But one question is, I think you said that 66%, or the results said that 66% of farmers on average think good pesticides kill all insects immediately. Now, that's a bit of an issue if you're wanting to protect your beneficial insects. How do you work with farmers to get over that perception that a good pesticide kills everything immediately?
Right. So this needs lots of farmers education and awareness program. So in many of our scaling projects, what we try to do, the farmer education is an important component. So right now we have an ongoing project in both Cambodia and Laos PDR, where we are doing a large scale demonstration with this different kinds of stakeholders in major vegetable production regions. So here the farmers are engaged right from the beginning, so that they will learn how they can produce a good crop without losing much the quantity because of the pest and diseases, but also produce a good quality produce. So the farmer education is the key to change the attitude of the farmers.
Okay, excellent. And just one quick, if you can answer this quite quickly, from a question here from Ben, are the pesticide shops funded by the major global chemical companies? And two, who is supplying the biopesticides, regional or global producers?
Okay, so of course the pesticide shops are the kind of like the retail agents of the global companies. And also they get lots of incentives and additional benefits if they increase their sales. So naturally, that's a common one. In terms of biopesticides, mostly it is produced by the local or the regional companies. There are no big companies producing or making available biological pesticides.
Okay, great. Hey, thank you so much. What an interesting presentation, and so much detail in there. And I'm sure people will be looking closely at some of those results with a bit more time to ponder them. Great to have you on board and have all that rich information shared, and very important to see those different case studies across Southeast Asia. So thank you very much for joining us, Srinivasan.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce our next speaker today, and it is Dr. Joseph Goeb, who is an assistant professor from the Department of Agricultural, Food and Resource Economics at Michigan State University. Joseph, welcome. You're
Sorry.
just on. Oh, yeah, there we go.
Thank you. Thanks, Alison. Yeah, very glad to be able to share some results from my research on information interventions. We've done 2 randomized controlled trials of some very brief information sharing around pesticide, one in Zambia, and then one ongoing project in Myanmar. Trying to change slides. There we go. Okay, so very briefly, we'll provide a couple background slides, and then I'll get into a very high level detail of the overview of research and share some kind of important results. And yeah, Myanmar, this is preliminary. It's an ongoing project, but have a few common results across the studies to share. So from a farmer's health perspective, there are 2 main components of pesticide risk. There's the toxicity, which is kind of like the potential harm or hazard of the product. And then there's also the exposure, which I can think of as kind of the probability of harm, or the probability of experiencing acute symptoms from pesticide use. And in a lot of developing countries, Zambia and Myanmar included, farmers have access to these highly toxic pesticides, and they have low use rates of personal protective equipment. And the result is a lot of acute symptoms from pesticide use, which ultimately leads to lower productivity, lost work days, and treatment costs. So these are health costs that have very real impacts on livelihoods for rural farmers. Conceptually, there may be 2 possibilities for these risky behaviors that farmers are engaging in. One, maybe they know about the risks, but they don't have the alternatives available to them to avoid the risks. And then 2, maybe farmers do not know about the risks. So it's kind of both things, I think, in a lot of contexts, but our research is kind of focused on the second one, trying to understand where kind of brief messages on pesticides can change safety practices among farmers. So very high level overview. This slide does not get at the complexity of these supply chains for pesticides, but just to note that pesticide use is increasing in a lot of developing countries. And as it is increasing, the supply chains are expanding and evolving and reaching a lot more farmers in more rural areas. So farmers have access to a diverse and evolving choice set of pesticides. And as we've seen in the previous presentations, sometimes the information flows along the supply chain. So farmers at the end of the supply chain often receive information from their local agro dealers at the village level. Now, extension services are generally limited on pesticides. We're working to change that, but it's partly a function of low budgets and kind of a low priority and just trying to catch up to the market on what's available in these local markets on pesticides. So pesticides are very complicated technologies, right? And there's a lot of products on the market, and there's changing availability of those products from season to season. New products are entering. So it's a lot to learn for a farmer. And oftentimes they have to learn that on the fly from experience or from other farmers. Complete information on pesticide use is complex and very nuanced, crop specific and pest specific. And it's harder to learn and to transfer knowledge on that, and it involves kind of more detailed interventions. But some information may be relatively simple. It could be easier to learn and easier to transfer, particularly on toxicity and how harmful these products are on a pesticide by pesticide basis. So in our research, we have conducted one study in Zambia in 2015. We interviewed 512 tomato farmers. It was a randomized controlled trial of a lead farmer training. It was focused on tomato growers because they use a lot of highly toxic pesticides. And there was very limited extension available to these farmers in the absence of our training. In Myanmar, we're doing something kind of parallel to that, focusing on fall armyworm among tomato farmers. And we have about 1,500 maize farmers in this study. It's not done yet. We just have a baseline data, and we will assess kind of the impacts of our intervention upon the conclusion of the current monsoon growing season. But we were restricted in what we could use to deliver farmers some information in Myanmar due to mobile network restrictions and kind of the political instability there. We had to pivot to an SMS-based information intervention where we sent messages directly to farmers, and we also sent messages to lead farmers again, who we asked to pass on that information to farmers in their local areas. So getting into the results. So although these are very different contexts, right? Different countries, different crops, different 6 years later, we see some kind of parallel trends happening in where farmers get information and what information they trust. So in our context, other farmers were the most likely source of information on pesticides, and also the most trusted, right? So farmers are talking to other farmers about what pesticides they use and trying to learn that way. Agro dealers are also common, with about 20% of our sample in each case receiving information directly from the agro dealers. And these are largely the local village level retailers. But there's a pretty steep drop off in trust, right? It's still high, above 60% in both studies, but much lower than it is for other farmers. And in both these contexts, government extension has pretty low penetration, specifically on pesticide use at less than 10%. So as part of the study, we assessed farmer knowledge, and what we found is that they had good understanding of pesticide risks generally, meaning that they were aware that pesticides have health risks to themselves, and they were aware that personal protective equipment can reduce those health risks. However, they kind of demonstrated low knowledge of the products on the market. They couldn't really name specific products to control specific pests. And they often rely on agro dealers at the point of sale for that information. In Zambia is kind of an interesting result. There was actually a perception among farmers that higher prices led to implied higher efficacy or higher quality products, right? Which is definitely not the case, but it's just a simplifying heuristic that they used in the absence of information on what is an effective or quality pesticide. They used price as a signal for that information. And also in both studies, we kind of observed low knowledge of toxicity, and actually farmers overperceive the health risks of many pesticides. And so there's kind of this perception that poison is poison and all pesticides are equally toxic. And to assess that, we asked farmers about the toxicity level of a red label pesticide versus a green label pesticide. And this is following the WHO standard classification on pesticide labeling, where red is considered highly hazardous and green is kind of unlikely to cause acute harm in normal use. Many farmers correctly identified the red label as being highly toxic, but very few, less than a third, could identify the green label as being lower toxicity than the red label. This is a problem, right? Because if there are no perceived benefits of the less toxic pesticide, then farmers would not choose that. Other things equal, would not choose the less toxic pesticide. So flat risk perceptions documented in both countries. I should also mention that about a third of the farmers in both countries just did not know or were not aware of the color labels at all. So that was part of our information intervention. And now I'm talking specifically about Zambia because our results are not yet in from Myanmar. But our information intervention, giving farmers information, broke the price efficacy perception. So they no longer thought that high price pesticides were more effective. They had better knowledge of the pesticides in the market for pest control. And it also increased demand for low toxicity pesticides. So there was a substitution among the farmers that received information from higher toxicity pesticides to lower toxicity pesticides. So obviously using lower toxicity pesticides is a better outcome for the farmer in terms of their health and also for the environment. And there are many other benefits from using low toxicity pesticides than high toxicity pesticides. However, we did not observe a noticeable difference in demand for personal protective equipment. So this is two demand curves, one for the treatment group that received the information, one for the control group that did not. And they're pretty parallel, right? They're very similar. So the reason for this is that farmers had kind of high prior knowledge. So they kind of already understood that, yes, using personal protective equipment reduces my health risks from pesticide use. So giving them information on that didn't really change their behavior. There are other constraints to PPE use. Didn't appear to be information restricting that. So yeah, just a brief summary. Pesticides are an important part of IPM, right? And used commonly throughout the world. And there appears to be limited information reaching farmers specifically on pesticide use. Other farmers are common in our study area and most trusted. Agro dealers are also a common source, but appear to be less trusted. These supply chains are ever evolving, and it adds to the complexity in the learning and makes it more challenging to train farmers on what to use as products move in and out of the market. Farmers generally undervalued the health benefits of less toxic pesticides, and flat risk perceptions were prevalent, meaning that across the toxicity classes, farmers perceived them all to be kind of highly toxic. And we found that information can change knowledge and behaviors, but it's important from our experience to identify the knowledge gaps and to identify and to design the information appropriately. So toxicity information was effective at changing behavior as farmers shifted demand to less toxic products. But PPE information on exposure and personal protective equipment had a null effect. So it did not actually change demand for personal protective equipment. So hopefully I didn't go too fast or too slow. That concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions.
That was excellent, Joseph. Thank you so much. Yeah, lots of information there too. So I'm sure, again, that people will need to have a close look at some of that in detail. I've got a couple of questions here. I mean, you talked about, for example, where farmers already have higher prior information on PPE, for example, that giving them more information didn't really seem to make any impact. So what else can you do? Did you look at what are some of the other behavioural modes or methods that you could use that might be more effective? Do you have any insight there?
It's a great question. So we did a kind of a small group of farmers follow-up interviews, kind of focus group sessions to kind of understand okay, information wasn't the constraint on PPE adoption. What is it, right? And for a lot of farmers, it's discomfort. So they don't want to be wearing masks or rubber gloves or tightly knitted cotton suits while they're in their fields, particularly for maize, right? Because it's such a large area you have to cover in applying a pesticide. But also it's cost too. So if you, for instance, a decrease in price, so if there was a subsidy on personal protective equipment use of about 20%, right? And these are not super expensive items. They cost only a few dollars, the dust masks and the gloves. But if you were to subsidize them by about 20%, you would get about a 30% increase in demand and people actually willing to pay that price for these items. So there are a couple other factors that weigh into it, but information didn't seem to be the constraint in our study in Zambia.
Okay, excellent, interesting. You talked about government extension services that had very low penetration. Why? Is it just because they're under-resourced and not there?
Partly because in Zambia anyway, the priorities are different, right? So the government extension agents around agriculture are responsible for administering the fertilizer or the input support subsidy program, which is a really big draw on their time and demands, and they really don't have a lot of time available to visit farmers and be discussing things like pesticide use. So it really is a resource thing. I think in a lot of areas, there's at least a government extension officer nearby. Farmers would be able to identify that person if you ask them, but not a whole lot of time available for one-on-one or even group trainings on pesticide use.
Okay, and here's an interesting one, and it sort of came up actually in the last presentation. I didn't get the opportunity to ask it, but I guess, you know, there's sometimes a need for using pesticides, but there has to be economic justification and responsible use of them. Do farmers understand, I guess, that when they're justified, do they understand the economic justification, I guess, calculation, or how to make that calculation to understand when best to use them? Do you think, are they thinking in that detail or from that perspective?
In my experience, at least, speaking from my experience in Zambia and again in Myanmar, these farmers are very risk averse, right? And what often happens is if you see a pest, something that can damage your crop, your livelihood, you want to get rid of it. And it's a difficult thing to kind of observe optimal action thresholds, right? And that requires more detailed training, things like farmer field schools, other ways at getting detailed information to farmers on those action thresholds and other ways to control pests. But I think risk aversion is a big factor for a lot of the poor rural farmers.
Yeah, it's a good point. And we had an earlier speaker in an earlier workshop that said that farmers are loss averse. Yeah. Even more so than risk averse, in that they're very scared to lose part of their crop. And I think that makes sense because we're talking about smallholder farmers that are often not huge, economic sort of bandwidth, I guess, to lose part of their crop. One last question. You talked about how other farmers are the most trusted, and this trust is quite an important aspect, I guess, of decision-making behaviour. How can you identify which farmers are good to focus on, perhaps, if you were to design a program? Is there any particular farmers that stand out as potential sort of lead trusted advisors?
That's a good question. In our research, we asked them, right? So we asked everyone in a village, to kind of list their most trusted farmers, and from those lists kind of made assessments and decisions on who the lead farmers should be to disseminate information. I believe you had another speaker in one of your other sessions share research on more detail on social networks and farming. And I would point people to that work, Ben Yashe and Mubarak, I think.
Yep, very interesting.
Yeah, yeah, very good work there. Yep.
Yeah, no, excellent. Okay, thanks, and thanks for the plug for the other workshop. That was an excellent presentation as well. Hey, thank you so much for sharing that, and we're really interested to have you back later on when you've got your final results from Myanmar as well. I think that'll be really interesting to share with the whole action plan. Thank you, and have a great night. I know it's late there in your part of the world, so good night and thank you.
Thank you much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Joseph. Okay, I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, and that's Dr. Yunita Winarto, who is the Emeritus Professor in Anthropology at the Department of Anthropology at the Universitas, Indonesia. And in this presentation, she's going to draw on findings of a longitudinal study of pesticide use of rice farmers in Java. So Yunita, welcome. If you could load your presentation.
Is it okay?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Good morning or good evening or good afternoon to everybody here. So thank you very much, Alison, for inviting me to share my experience. So I would like to introduce myself. I'm an anthropologist. I'm not an entomologist. So you know that I did my research by being immersed with the farmers. So from the first year, I observed the IPM Farmer Field School in West Java. So in 1990, so this is the book published on the basis of my PhD thesis. So I observed, but up to now, the majority of farmers are still being trapped in the cage of pesticides use. It is not easy for them to get rid of pesticides use, and those who have to try to avoid the use of pesticides, it's like a struggle in how to get out of the trap. So when I returned to my fields, when I did my observation on the IPM farmers, and then I went to Australia to take my course and then return, and then the farmers told me, we are like plants. The government sowed the seeds, so they were so enthusiastic to get the information, to get the knowledge. They said we are so grateful for the government that improved our knowledge. But the government sowed the seeds, but they didn't watering the plants. So this is the situation to portray how's the condition the farmers. Yeah. So sorry. I have, okay. Now, these are some pictures in the first year of my research in Subang, West Java. Farmers used to mix a cocktail of medicine. They call it medicines, not poisons, not pesticides. Yeah. So a farmer here is a non-IPM farmer. This is IPM farmer, but joined together. So the farmer here already lost of cash. He didn't have any cash left, but the pests are still infesting his plants. So he boiled 2 kilograms of carbofuran, the granule insecticide, very poisonous. Instead of using 20 kilograms, he bought 2 kilograms and then mixed with the other pesticides. So it is, according to him, just to save the cost. And this is like a collective spraying was common if they thought that the pest infestation is severe. And like the previous speakers, so farmers used to go to the shops, and this is the shop owner, the lady, and one farmer came and then asked the lady, like he asked pharmacist or even a general practitioner, yeah? My plants are sick, infested by brown plant hopper. What is the most powerful medicine? So this is the question, and I felt so amazed that the lady has had several waiters, shop, her assistants who didn't have any education, and they became the knowledge provider. So the farmers also asked me when I was in the field, why the more numerous obat medicines we have, the more numerous illnesses infesting my plants. They didn't understand why. And farmers were ignorant of the work and the effects of obat they used to kill the cows of illnesses and to restore their plants onto their field's ecosystem and their own body. Like one farmer asked me, what was happening with my heart, with my lymph, with my kidney? I asked, nobody came to tell you this? No, you didn't know. So, but yet they kept using it as a protection and an insurance, yeah, to secure their households. So that's the picture I got when that was my first year in my field. And then, so the farmers, so the question is, why were the farmers being trapped in the use of pesticides? Now we know, I think all of us know, that there was a persisting schema. Schema is a connection of elements in people's brain, yeah, of controlling illnesses since the introduction of Green Revolution. So for example, if farmers observe their plants and the plants are sick, so I need to make it healthy again. So need to spray obat pesticides, and this is the time already to spray. Yes, it is time to spray, need to protect the plants and all elements, and then came up to the solution that need to buy pesticides or obat and purchase several obat, mix them, and then spray. So this is a combination of a prophylactic way of spraying obat because it's already the schedules to spray, even though there were no pests or disease, and also based on their observations. So they mix the expensive, the strong one, and expensive equals strong, and cheap equals not quite strong. So they mix it together because they cannot afford to buy the strong one with the most expensive ones. And then sometimes they also mix it with herbicides and or fungicides. If I ask them, they had to save time and energy, and they didn't understand what's the nitty-gritty of the works of chemicals in the mixture of pesticides or cocktails of pesticides. So, and there was an inclusion of pesticides in the package of rice intensification program. So part of the credit scheme by the government, and at the time there was an absence of any explanation. There was no knowledge transmission of how the chemicals work and what are the effects of pesticides on their plants, their fields, and their body. And the introduced term of obat as medicines, pesticides as medicine, this is very, very strongly internalized. Yeah, so it is an incorrect use of metaphor, but was internalized by farmers, and it became part of their vocabulary and new practice. So when I was in the field, I was also, what kind of obat medicines do you use? Because it's already part of their language, their vocabulary. And the intensive advertisement of various brands of pesticides continue, again, as previous speaker said, that the role of salesman or the agro dealer and then extension staff, yeah, because the extension staff used to bring the salesman to come, and sometimes they also promote the pesticides because they need additional salary, and they have a very low salary, and they got promise from the salesman, if you are able to sell this much quota, and then I will give you something. So the shop owners also the main knowledge producers. Then we know all about IPM farmer field schools. So instead of when I entered the field, there was a severe infestation of white rice stem borer. So brown planthopper severely attacked the rice plants only 1 year after our previous president, Suharto, received the award from the FAO because of his successful program and making rice as a self-sufficient product for 100 millions of Indonesian people. So he received the award, but 1 year later, it was an outbreak of brown planthopper. It damaged the rice products. That's why we all know how the FAO, in collaboration with the international and national entomologists, agroecologists, and also adult education, designed this new education method, yeah, the novel paradigm of learning, And if farmer asks, what is this? Then farmers have to find out by themselves. And I observed by myself, because I was there following farmers every day, that it changed their behavior to do more detailed observation of field ecosystem. And the most important thing is understand the presence and role of natural enemy. They didn't know before that insects can prey the other insects. What they know is only the birds, the snakes that prey upon rats, but insects prey upon insects they have never known and never seen it before. So it is very important knowledge element introduced through IPM farmer field schools. Evaluating the economic threshold is a bit difficult because counting the calculation is not easy. So anyway, just to use your feeling, just it is balance, and then making decisions accordingly. So that if time to spray arrives, then, oh, this is the schedule of spraying. Do we need to spray? And if they go to the field, oh, my plants are healthy. And how about the pests? Because they learn how to differentiate and to identify pests different from natural enemies. Yes, but not many. So how about the predators? Oh, yes, some. So is it still balanced? If it is still balanced, do we need to spray? And then some IPM farmers said, oh, no need to spray. So we can save the money and the yields are the same with those who are spraying. So they prove it. So this is a new schema of pest control introduced by the IPM farmer field schools, and then change the farmers' behavior from prophylactic spray to the decisions based on observation. But anyway, unfortunately, there was a resurgence of brown plant hopper and viruses. The two kinds of viruses because of the brown plant hopper outbreaks over the period of last decade, 2011, 2017. Why? Because of the La Nina in 2010, very strong La Nina. It's very humid. And then there was outbreaks of brown plant hopper because brown hopper already endemic pest in various places in Java. And I took the picture here. You can see the different intensity of hopper burns damaging the rice in Klaten in Central Java. And then one pest disease observer took one rice hill and showed to me that in one rice hill, there were brown plant hoppers plus viruses attacking the farmers' plants. And then again, there was La Nina in 2016, 2017. And unfortunately, the government see the La Nina as an opportunity to increase production because high productivity still became the paradigm of government's policy to increase production. So they asked the farmers to spray to plant rice 3 times. So the IPM farmers and the farmers with whom I'm working in improving their understanding of agrometeorology refused to plant 3 times, but they have to because this is a must. And those who refuse it then got also the brown plant hopper infestation, and the most damaging were the virus because you cannot do anything with the virus. And unfortunately, when I was there in the field, farmers asked from where the viruses came. They didn't know that the host of the virus is brown plant hopper. So lack of knowledge. Now, but yet farmers were still bathing. We use the term bathing the plants with pesticides. This is my picture when I was in the field in 2018 in Indramayu following the outbreaks of brown plant hopper and viruses, and farmers still mix how many is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, still mixing it together. So they use the cocktails, and the advertisement was still going on. Not only the selling pesticides in the special agriculture shops, selling seeds, fertilizers, and pesticides, but also at home in farmers' village in their home. This you can see here the pesticides, and in one room, even though in different cupboard, but see this is the pesticides, these are the milks, and these are the medicines and candies, etc. So it was sold, and no code of conduct was implemented, yeah, to how to distribute well. And this is the book that I published as an editor because of my fellows and myself, and we're so, what do you call it? We're so concerned about the food crisis. Yes, because if you have hundreds or thousands hectares damaged by viruses, then the production, of course, will go down. Then the food crisis, but the false mind of using pesticides still going on. Why is it still going on? So this is the picture of one lady harvesting the plants full of brown plant hopper. It is a failure, harvest failure. So, and then I did my research again on pesticides use, because there was an what do you call it, outbreak of brown plant hopper 2011-12, and then again 2016-2017. I returned to my previous field site. So in Indramayu, 100 farmers, and you can see here the highest, number of intense pesticide spray is 10 times, and from 1 year to 20. And then I return again, I think 2015, 3 years later, and still the same picture. Here, 10 times, and again here is up to 17 times. So the examples of pesticides cocktails and cost we collected in details from 100 farmers in 2 seasons. There were 243 different mixed combinations with 2 to 7 products, and only 11 farmers introduced 1 product. And these are only 2 cases of the cocktails, 8 times with diverse cocktails up to 7 products of farmers operating in 4.5 hectare. The total is 1 hectare, $185, but in comparison to 0.4 hectare, 10 times using the same cocktail, 3 products, up to $432. And here in Indramayu, 3 years later, even though the cocktail variety is reduced, but again, the total cost is not. So it's reach up to $133,944. And you can imagine it's more than 1 billion of rupiah. Yeah? Then I also made a comparison between Indramayu, here still 10 times the highest, with the Klaten, with the picture when I visited in 2011. And I found out that the frequency was different. Only 3 times is the highest, 3 times, but still 10 times. Still practice also 8 times. So why was there any difference? Because the land, the fields the farmers operate was smaller, much smaller than in Indramayu. Also, they were less, economic level is less than the farmers in Indramayu, so less of capitals. And also the intensity of pest disease outbreaks was not as severe as in Indramayu. I think because of the frequency of pesticides used there in Indramayu, but also because of the ecological engineering introduced by my colleague and entomologist from Gajah Mada University, maybe you know all, Professor Andi Trisyono and his fellows. Yeah, so it helped the farmers to, because if there are no pests, why should we just waste our money, because they do not have a lot of cash in their hands. So the total cost is only US $2,004 for 51 hectare. Now, so why was it happening like this? So in my analysis, can I just go quick?
Definitely.
There's an interaction between intrapersonal structure and extrapersonal structure, which influence the behavior. So as also mentioned by previous speakers, there are schema, emotion, motivation, belief, trust, access to resources, and there are a list of sources, and IPM Farmer Fiscals Ecological Engineering, and the one that I introduced later, influence their schema, but the extrapersonal structure, still the state policy regulation, government subsidies, pesticides promotion, etc., and the condition of pesticides infestation, but also the absence or presence of long-term educational commitment. There is no long-term educational commitment with the IPM program. So these are the registered brands of pesticides increase. So I observed that there are diverse strategies, not only persisting in wise use of pesticides, but no spraying if unnecessary, and moving away from chemical pesticides. This is my last slide that I would like to share it with you, that I introduced science field shops, that the farmers have to learn how to measure rainfall and observe, not weekly like in IPM Farmer Fiscals, but every day. And then they have to discuss what the vulnerability they found, and then they present analysis, discuss what's the solution, evaluating yields, organizing, etc. And then they received the scenario. Yeah, the seasonal scenario is important. Climate scenario is now introduced in the science field shop, and this is the picture drawn by one IPM farmer, and also an what will join the agrometeorology. So he received the climate scenario, he counted the rainfall data, and then look at the water condition, observation of the population, and then also the varieties, the age of the varieties, and then decided when to plant, when to transplant, and then when to harvest, to avoid the vulnerabilities stage during the growth of the crops. So thank you, and the yields are much better than the others, plus 2.5 tons per hectare. And this is my last slides of the graph that made by rainfall observer in Ramayu. Thank you. Sorry for my.
Oh, that was wonderful. That was wonderful, Yunita, and such a lot of information again in that. I wish we had more time because there's a lot to talk about there, and I really like bringing the climate aspect into that, and the weather aspect into sort of a more holistic systems perspective for farmers to actually realize all these different interactions between climate and pest management and biodiversity and the economic assessment, yields, etc. So I think that's very important. Really nice to see somebody who spent so much time in the field talking to farmers, and really interesting your emphasis on the use of certain words that become kind of really important in people's conversations and perceptions, like pesticides as medicine, I think is really interesting. I've just got a few people asking, will the slides be shared after the webinar? And yes, they will. And lots of discussion was in the background I saw when you were speaking. For example, someone was saying in the Philippines that pesticides as medicine is also, they use that term as well, some of the farmers. So really, really interesting. Some questions here. Okay. Have you observed in your interaction with farmers any differences in decision-making based on the gender of the farmers? So you gave an example of a woman salesperson, so that's not a farmer, but do you see differences according to the gender and how they perceive pests and pest management and pesticide use?
Yeah, the gender issue is, it is different in different places. For example, in Indramayu and also Klaten, they themselves told me that farmers are men, women are farmers' wives. So women can influence the decision making by their husbands, but anyway, the husbands still have a very strong what do you call it? Strong role, power. But it is interesting. When I followed one farmer who joined agrometeorological learning, he decided not to apply a chemical fertilizer or chemical pesticides too much. But the wife, because she only listened to our talk and she didn't measure the rainfall, etc. And they were quarrel, they were in fight because the ladies saw their neighbors are still spraying pesticides. It is time already to spray pesticides. Why you didn't spray pesticides? So it is interesting in that kind, but those who decide were the male, but the wife agree or not agree, they have to discuss it. But it's different from Yogyakarta in the central Java, in the hilly areas, where the majority of farmers are women. So because of the small fields, not only small, multiple crops, and in the dry rain-fed areas, and because of the limited areas for cultivation, then many husbands go out of the village and be the traders and be working in Yogyakarta, in the big cities. So women were the decision makers. Women were decided what to do with the pesticides. So when I joined their climate physicists and then followed with the agrometeorologists, so they could decide if they understood well. If they understood, then they will make a decision wisely. Yeah. Okay, yeah. That's it's different.
No, that's really interesting. No, and that's some of the research that we've looked at, is that each context is very different when we're talking about farmers in general, but also gender differences as well. Yeah. So that's really interesting. I'll have to follow up with you about that, Winarto, as part of our Women as IPM Leaders program. Another question though, I mean, you talked about, maybe it was in one of your slides, around a what was it, a code of conduct for pesticide sellers.
Yes.
I mean, is there no code of conduct there now? And what would you include in such a code of conduct if we were to develop one? And what do you think would need to be in there?
FAO has the code of conduct, yeah?
Yep.
It is disseminated to all countries. And I experienced that when I was in the field, it's like nothing, no regulation, no control. Where is the code of conduct? So it is interesting when I was invited by the FAO to join, to be present in an international conference with Peter Kenmore, etc. So there was, I forgot the name, an Indian, yeah, an IPM FAO senior person. He told us that the only country that refused his visit is Indonesia. So I asked why, because I do not know. I was not permitted to come to Indonesia because he would like to investigate. How about the code of conduct? Because we didn't, nobody. So actually, so that's why chemical pesticides, it's sold like consumer goods. You can go to the shops and then buy like that. Huh?
Yeah. Okay. A good point. Look, we've only got a limited time, but I've got a couple of questions, and you'll be able to jump on and answer these in writing as well. But I guess here's one from Maria. Do you think the massive OBA use contributed to the outbreaks of brown plant hoppers?
What the message?
Do you think that the huge use of OBA contributed to the outbreaks of brown plant hoppers?
Yes, of course, because it is still persisting. And in one of my slides, there was an increase in the number of the brands of pesticides registered and sold, distributed. So the more brands of pesticides are now in the market, and farmers could buy, it's like that. So, and because they still have the pest disease outbreaks and this insecurity, if they do not spray, then it killed natural enemies, of course. Then it caused the not only the endemic of the brown plant hopper, but also the co-evolution of the biotypes of brown plant hopper itself. And also the more vulnerable ecosystem of rice fields, the more they spray, then the more vulnerable their field. Yes, okay, that's right. Thank you. Yeah,
thank you very much. Great presentation. As I said before, really great to hear from somebody who's spent a lot of time. I mean, all of our speakers today have done that, so it's really valuable to hear the voices of the farmers coming through as well, Yunita. So thank you for joining us. You have a few questions there for you in the Q&A, so if you can answer them, we'd much appreciate that. And thank you for joining us. So I'd now like to invite our next speaker, which is Dr. Seng Kim Hyun, who is the agronomy director at IDE Cambodia, and she's been involved in the training of technical staff and intermediaries on responsible use of pesticides. Kim, welcome.
Thank you, Alison, for the introduction and for giving me the opportunity to present about pesticide education and training program in Cambodia. And I'm Kim Hyun. I'm also agronomist by training, but also I like to call myself IPM practitioner through my work. And I'm working for IDE Cambodia, where we mostly have been known as, the value chain pioneer or market system. And so far we work in Cambodia nearly 30 years. We are not research organization. We more focus on the outreach and value chain. And so far we have supported to improve the life of nearly 1 million households in Cambodia, and through either agriculture awards. And currently we have 5 agriculture projects, and a lot of them are market system, USAID funded, or value chain funded by New Zealand aid program, except one project. And I would like to acknowledge here Dr. Muni Ampan, the director of IPM Innovation Lab, who has supported us for nearly more than 5 years to implement the research. We test biological control, biopesticide in comparison to the efficacy in comparison to pesticide use. And we found that most of our research, nearly 5 years, we found that actually a lot of biopesticide as effective as conventional pesticide. And also, I like the presentation of Srini. He presented, but if he will conduct the study again, I'm sure there will be more availability of biopesticide now, because thanks to our work and also with a few organizations or development projects, there are more available of biopesticide and more awareness about biopesticide in Cambodia. And this is the outline of my presentation. And like I say, we are not a research focus, but we more like sharing the practical experience from the field. So I will just briefly present to you about agriculture and pesticide use in Cambodia, and also more about our training program. And at the end, I will share a lot of photos from the field, and I would like to call it like the photo of change, because what we are doing, we want to see the change in practice with farmers, especially the misuse of pesticide. And as a previous speaker already rightly pointed, that it's not easy to change. So the agriculture in Cambodia contribute about 25 or sometimes it depends on the years, nearly 30% of the GDP of Cambodia. So it's very important sectors. And also now we produce more for export oriented or bigger scale production. So pesticide use is almost like unavoidable. And also we have documented several constraints with pesticide use as well among the grower, and also they are concerned about from the consumer themselves, and they also we notice increasingly pesticide resistant and also impact to the local environment. And so recently we have done a study and we found that a lot of consumers actually aware about that. So they are more preference for locally grown but safe. And by safe now, they don't rely on trust like before. Before there was a perception among local Cambodian to believe that locally grown means safe. So we believe that the import of food of pesticide and locally grown vegetable or other crop means safe. But now people need to approve, like EU claims safe, whether you are like CAMGAP certified, like good agricultural practice certification or organic, and also government try to enforce that. And there's another initiative, is kind of group guarantee, but more like initiated by FAO and IFOAM. It's farmer group guarantee, they call participatory guarantee system. And so in all of our projects, we do the assessment first, and also we take pesticide use really seriously. So we some of the project, including the IPM Innovation Lab or the other USAID funded project, value chain project called Cambodia Harvest 2, it's a requirement that we have our own pesticide evaluation report and safe use action plan. And throughout the project, we have to follow that guideline. And I will share more later if people are interested. So what are the problems that we find out when we conduct the assessment about pesticide use in Cambodia? I think it's very similar to other countries in the region, and also with the previous already presented, like farmers are still using highly toxic pesticides, some even listed in the suspended list of the government, and there are also lack of availability and use of personal protective equipment, PPE, and farmers do not maintain pesticide application equipment. Usually we found that smallholder farmers just have one backpack sprayer and one nozzle, and they use for everything, and they never calibrate the sprayer at all. And farmers are unaware of the safe use practices. Usually they don't even know how to calculate the amount to use for spraying. So usually most smallholder farmers, they end up have a half tank full of pesticide already mixed to be used for the next spraying, maybe in the next week. So usually they think those are very valuable. They usually store them around the house, can be in the kitchen or sometimes in the animal house, which is very risky behavior. So, and farmer also, they use pesticide in a way that really concerned about the ecosystem. They spray the pesticide when the pollinator, particularly bee, very active, like in the early morning. And also they use the very popular pesticide to use in Cambodia are those in the group of neonicotinoids. They're very widely known to be harmful for bee. And also sometimes they like to grow close to the water body and there is no barrier or anything. So they are very often, we notice pesticide drift from spraying to the open surface water. And we also talk to the government and we noticed that there's still weak regulation capacity from the department that in charge of pesticide registration and control because of limited resource. And another point that we find out, especially one of the project that we work with mostly in the area close to the border, like Thai border in particular, farmers in that area believe that pesticide return, actually the same pesticide but return in Thai language, selling in Thailand, they are more effective than pesticide selling locally here. So it's also similar case with the Vietnamese border. And the pesticide seller in general or extension officer, they do not have sufficient training program, and most of the training actually rely on development projects like us and a few others. And they're increasingly concerned about the empty pesticide container. There is no proper disposal for farmer, recommendation for farmer yet. And this is some photo we collect from the field when we go and conduct the evaluation about the pesticides. So you see there's a lot of waste of pesticides throwing close to the water body and also even just within the farm. In this case, it's a fruit tree farm. And so for this reason, we have designed 2 training programs with specific target audience. So one is we train the training of trainer, knowing that the importance of the pesticide, seller agent. They are usually in Cambodia. We don't have a lot of international company, but small local company who usually distribute the pesticide, like already all pesticide already passed the patent. So they make a lot of our pesticide and market that, and so they use the model like selling agent. They have staff, technical staff who will go and also receive incentive from the amount of sale they made. So we target those people, and because they are also university graduates, they're highly knowledgeable, so the training is different and also the content also different. And that's another approach. We target smallholder farmer around awareness, raising about safety of pesticides. So the photo A here is like the in-class presentation for the trainer, and here is on the field for the farmer, for the smallholder farmer. So for the training program, like I say, we target the private partner, and in some of the project, it's a compliant because they are our grantee. So it's a USAID compliant that they learn about the US regulation, about the environmental stewardship of USAID, and or to extension worker from other development project, or very often also from the government, and mostly around awareness of safe use of pesticide and also integrated pest management. And we hope that the training, the goal of the training, because they are very key extension agents, so they're more likely to work closely with farmers. So we hope that by provide training them, by equip them with a lot of knowledge, they can also utilize that, but also can influence in their when they work with farmer or with the pesticide shop, the retailer shop that they work with. So the content of the pesticide of the training, like I mentioned earlier, it's vary from a lot of things, and also if it with USAID funded, there is a list of recommended pesticide that our partner need to use, and those lists generated from the locally available and registered pesticide, cross-check with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, US EPA, of what are the pesticide recommended and what not to recommend. And also there's a lot of awareness around pesticide resistance and the use of mode of action, and because they are also highly knowledgeable, so we also use the platform like the IRAC for the pesticide, and also the FRAC in their smartphone app to check what are the mode of action and what should recommend, and so on.
So 2 minutes, Kim.
Okay, I will try to be quick then. So these are some of the training, like the feedback from the training, but in general, there are already requests for more trainings. And I will finish that. I will go to the safety of pesticide awareness training among the farmer. And also they're key for some of market actors, like some of you we call pesticide shop, or in our case, we call input retailer, because they are the shop like sell everything, sell all the input seed, pesticide, fertilizer, and also some like even drip irrigation and so many other. And also village collectors, they're key, they work closely with farmer, and they're also trusted by farmers. And the content of the training, it's just because like many speakers already presented, farmers use very little PPE. So the main focus is for them to promote the PPE use and the safe storage and disposal. And also the safe for the consumer is strictly imposed the withholding period. So some of the trend, the photo from the field, as you see the first one, because farmer only believe what they see. So in this case, we use the white paper cloth. Our team really creative. They use white paper cloth to wrap around a sprayer, and they use the dye color to mimic pesticide. So the guy is spraying, and then you can see all the drop stain in their body. So farmer will see and reflect to the actual that is they spray, that's what they got. And also we also introduced this proper PPE to farmers. So we also document what are the, later on, like our M&E also collected what are the PPE farmer adopted and take an example, gloves, boot or mask or respiratory mask and so on. So this is what we see the change. We are not research focused, so we don't have a lot of statistics to share, but mostly photo from the field. Like it was very common that farmers were shot when they spray, and there is no mask and also pesticide drift on their body. But now you can see there's not a lot of fully adopt of the PPE, but at least they wear more. They start wearing masks, they wearing boot, and it's hard to see, and long sleeve and also hat and so on. That's what we like to see, and we hope that there will be more later on when farmers more aware. And also there was concern about where they store the pesticide. Usually that's very common in the field. When you go, they pack pesticide in the bag or bottle and hanging in the field, or sometimes even at their home or close to the animal house. But now we introduce this more pesticide storehouse, where it's cheap and easier to find. There is the resource in the village, and you see the woman here standing with all the pesticide that she's store, and also they have lots, so it's far away from the children and from home. And this is my last slide. We also do a lot of awareness raising about pesticides. So we do printed material like you see here. We distribute to the government office. We also distribute. We work more closely with pesticide shop like you see here. We print the poster here. We have staff very often go and check and do the coaching. Do the retailer understand about the safety of pesticide and what are the messages they should give to farmer and so on. But now we want to have more outreach scale, and also we start developing our own smartphone app. Actually, we document the database for for 5 or 6 years already, but now we are in the process of converting to a smartphone app so that there will be more outreach to farmers. So that's all my presentation, I think.
Kim, that was excellent. If you just go back to that last slide.
Yeah.
It's great to see all the different pictures, I think, in the field. I think it was a great presentation. I like to see the before and the after photos, because it's really nice to see what is actually happening there and the change that you're helping to bring about. Just a couple of quick questions, because we're at the very end, but I wanted to ask you, for example, you said there was a lot more demand for trainer programs, and I guess what's preventing that at the moment? Is it just a cost getting the funding for running those programs, or is it the you need more people, or how go?
Thank you. So the government, they have only one office, so they don't have robust ongoing training program. Usually they have a few day basic training for retailer to start opening the shop. And for those who working for the pesticide company, the company mostly provide training about their product only, but not general knowledge and so on. So there is no one like mandatory to provide training for them. So there are a few development projects, but a lot of them are not mandatory. They don't work in this area. So when we conduct the training, we invite the staff, technical staff from the intermediary staff, the one who distribute the pesticide. They usually agronomy people who don't have knowledge in the area that they are working, or some they have very basic knowledge about what they are working. So with a few day training course, it's still, they still that their knowledge is limited, so they always request for more. And for us as well, our project mostly our value chain project, so that just set aside compliance program or just one of the components. So we cannot just conduct the training for everybody ongoing, and also if we had to respond to the other mandatory and funding also is another concern.
Yeah, sure. A question around the smartphone app. Do you find that farmers, is this for farmers to use the smartphone app, or is it for the intermediaries, the sellers to use? And how are farmers and intermediaries, do they enjoy using the smartphone app as a way of communication?
Yes, they do. And this is for both, and actually for intermediary, because or how to say, the import retailer shop, because they are usually the housewife or the spouse, and who mostly are also farmer. They don't have knowledge in this area. And in our app, we use a lot of photo because we have been documenting this for many years. So usually they match the symptom with the photo, and also even the recommendation of the pesticide. We also use a lot of photo, like you see here, the photo from the pesticide that we recommend, and also the PPE that we also introducing. And farmer, we have done the study before we convey this into a smartphone app. That's now maybe about at least 30% of farmer own a smartphone. Okay. So they mostly can use a smartphone app, or they start using social media like Facebook is very popular. So we also spread message through Facebook group as well.
Excellent. Oh, great. Thank you. Here's a question from Maria, and we're just going to have one more question, and I'm going to change the slides at the background to end. This question is, did you also include sprayer calibration and pesticide computations of active ingredients in the training in Cambodia?
Yeah, we do. Like I said, one of the problem is farmers don't even know how to calibrate the sprayer themselves. So that's one of the content of the training. And also we thank to a lot of other who have produced a lot of video there. So we have staff and we have video to help them to know how to calibrate, and also what kind of nozzle to use and so on. So that's one of the key that we introduce, is actually to calibrate the pesticide sprayer.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kim. That was a great presentation. You've got wonderful feedback, by the way, in the comments, the chat session, and also in the Q&A, thanking you for such a great presentation. It's brilliant to see those photos and actually see that action on the ground. And we're really pleased that you could join us today. If you could answer a few of those questions in the Q&A, that would be great before we go. I'm just going to actually introduce now our sort of summary, and I think I'm just going to see if I've got the page. Here, Putra, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here, Alison.
Putra's going to give a very quick summary. I'm really sorry, everyone, we've gone over time, but we've got some great presentations. So Putra really has got the hard job of making a sort of 2-minute summary. So off you go, Putra.
Okay, so thank you, Alison. So from Dr. Mankad, some of the interesting stuff were that farmers knowing that they can actually carry out and know how to do these changes are important to determine the success of behavioral change. We should also acknowledge that not only farmers need education, and governments and other stakeholders in the supply chain also affect behavior changes in using these pesticides. And of course, different regions may have different rationalities when using pesticides. It's evidence in Australia and probably it is in other countries. From Dr. Srini, we have seen that even after farmers know that there are health problems and farmers are actually experiencing them, farmers still tend to use synthetic pesticides. But the good side is that biopesticides are gaining trust in some countries, which is definitely a good sign. And maybe we still need interventions to increase these use of pesticides in farmers in certain countries. From Dr. Joseph Goeb, besides actual health concerns, it may be also important to acknowledge that when you get sick, you are actually losing workdays, and those to treat those costs, these treatments, you need costs, which is important to say. The information about pesticides is always evolving, so that might be a lot for farmers to actually gain. And identifying knowledge gaps and actually challenges, and then designing information based on those information is important to increase adoptions of new technology. From Dr. Yunita, there are misconceptions for farmers by using the incorrect terms between medicines and poisons. Balancing between content, the knowledge gap, and how to communicate these information is important. And of course, to reduce insecticides use, we need continuous efforts. And from Dr. Kim Hin, we learned that Cambodia is enforcing safer growing practices and locally grown produce. Something interesting is that they are really taking into context what farmers are actually doing in the field and what are the actual knowledge gaps, and then actually moving from those points. And sufficient training is always required. That's all from me, Alison. Thank you.
Putra, that was wonderful. Putra is our project assistant on the ASEAN Action Plan, and I'd have to say, great summary at the end. So thank you very much. And I'd like to thank all our speakers today for participating, for sharing your insight. Extremely valuable, lots of information shared. Thank you for all of you for joining us today. Remember, there's one more session at the end of the year, well, towards November, where we'll be sharing sort of a summary and top tips, and you can register at the link below. I'll send that to you in the email. So thank you, all of you. Please keep safe, share your information with us. We love to hear from you, and thank you once again. Have a great day. Thank you to all the speakers once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison, for organizing this.